Right. Well, I guess, I mean, it's not a, I don't know, it's not a huge deal. I really just wanted to, I was going to drop a PR related to Scallywag, and I just wanted to come on here and share a doc and just let people know that I was going to do that. So it didn't.
Yeah, totally. If you send that doc out to Kubernetes SIG Testing at googlegroups.com, and then maybe throw it into the Slack channel, like that'll get a lot of eyes on it too.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, I'll do that. But yeah, basically, and in a nutshell, what it is so rather than kind of just do it all at once, what I wanted to do, and what a couple of my colleagues suggested, is that we just take so there's a GitHub client that almost every service uses, right? And so the idea is create sort of a generic Scallywag interface and then refactor everything to use, and basically make that interface, base the interface on the existing GitHub client so that it's essentially already an implementation of the interface. And then instead of just passing around the concrete client, you're passing around an interface, which can be the, pointer to the client. So basically all it amounts to is kind of changing some names, moving some stuff around. It's going to look like a lot more than it is, because it's going to be a lot of like changing import statements in a bunch of little, it's just like a bunch of little small changes in a bunch of little areas. And because there's so many of them, I just, as far as I can tell, everything is going to work and tests pass and all that stuff. But I just I just know there's going to be little things that that could potentially go wrong. So it makes sense to kind of just do that, and then later on tackle actually implementing a Scallywag provider that's actually more generic.
Right. And I think you'll find in most places, even though there's a concrete client being passed, the method is expecting like some interface subset.
Right.
And we use that for testing out anyway. So I think there might even be fewer changes than what you're expecting. That approach does sound good. Were you able to, because I think you guys were saying that GitLab was going to be one of your first targets. Did you have a chance to poke around and see like if there's big differences between the two that would make that hard later?
Not like specifically in Scallywag. We haven't gotten into the implementation yet, but just our experience from Jenkins X is that the differences are differences tend to be just implementation details. I mean, they all kind of conceptually do the same things, and I kind of outline this a little bit in the doc that basically they all follow the GitHub model, right? GitHub is the standard that everybody is trying to kind of be, more or less. It's just that because they are different and because they have some incentive to kind of get you to use their thing and not other people's thing, the API calls are different, but I mean, conceptually, they're not different enough for it to be a huge problem. It's just a matter of translating some generic data model to the individual data models of each of these individual providers. So if you're talking about GitLab, if you're talking about Bitbucket, it's pretty straightforward. Now, if you stray away from the GitHub-like Git providers, you start talking about like a tool like Garrett, which just does code review, then it gets a little bit hairier. But if you're just talking about kind of the popular Git providers that are GitHub-like, that involve issue tracking and code review and kind of all the things that Prow expects to be there for it to work the way it works on GitHub, yeah, I don't estimate that's going to be a huge challenge.
So I would say that at a high level, I think that sounds really good. But ideally, when you are ready, I think it would be much preferred to sort of have some sort of design with some details about like what are the interfaces things are going to move to, and sort of, a document for us to talk about, and sort of something more concrete to look at and make sure that this seems sane or whatever.
Sure, yeah.
I definitely think that this seems, complicated enough that we should have that first and discuss there rather than just, seeing a PR that, changes all the GitHub stuff. But sure. I think in general, that's one thing which seems totally fine and seems like a sane and good approach. I think I think another thing that I would like to see thought about is if there are instances where we would want to write to a specific API, because I feel like either you wind up re-implementing everything or else you sort of wind up writing to the least common denominator, and maybe there's something specific about the checks API that isn't expressed as well in the GitLab client or something. And so there's a way where we want to specifically use, some part of the GitHub API or some part of the GitLab API to make it look like a, native GitLab or GitHub application at some point. So, I'd be interested in seeing, how you are thinking about that, and if at all. Maybe it's sort of just you can only write to the, Scallywag interface, and if Scallywag doesn't support something, then you're SOL, or maybe there's some other way to, turn this into the concrete or get the GitHub client from. I don't know exactly what the answers are, but I think that'd be another interesting thing, other than just the specific details about how it looks, but how to handle that problem of maybe there are some instances where there's more than just a data model change, and I want to talk to some weird, edge case in the API.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point. And I think that my thinking about that had been just that, so the existing GitHub client, there's no reason to do away with that, right? There's no reason to replace that per se. Really what we're doing is we're adding another alternative so that if people aren't using GitHub, they can use something else. And so in the scenario you're talking about, yeah, sure, somebody could do a Scallywag implementation that uses GitHub, or they could just use the existing GitHub client. And the idea is, and I do have a doc that I was sort of working on right up to the last minute, so I didn't get a chance to send it out before the call, but I'll send it out afterwards. And I get into this in a little more detail, but basically the idea is that, there will be some some entry in the config file that says use Scallywag, a little flag in the config file that says use Scallywag, true or false. If it's false, it's just going to go try to use the GitHub client, and it's going to work. Essentially, the idea is that for folks that are currently using Prow and are totally happy with the way it works, they'll just be able to keep using it exactly the same way. And there should be no surprises, no loss of functionality. I mean, the problem you're talking about is in the nature of these things, right? You create a generic interface, there's going to be some loss because in those minute details that differ. So I think that I think that is that the cleanest and most elegant solution? I don't know, but I think that it makes sense to me, just because the one thing I don't want to do is to affect anybody that is currently using Prow and is totally happy with it and is totally happy using GitHub. Really, this should be like, they shouldn't even notice this is happening.
Are you planning to make it handle, is the goal to make Hook handle webhooks from GitLab in addition to GitHub?
Yeah, that's the idea. The idea is that Hook will just get a webhook, and then it'll send it to Scallywag, and Scallywag will say, okay, this is Scallywag will figure out what needs to happen, where it needs to go, or Scallywag will send back some sort of generic thing that Hook can understand, and Hook doesn't have to understand specific, GitHub-based events. So that it does sort of involve this event, and this is a part that needs to be fleshed out a little bit more. But basically, yeah, Hook gets a webhook from someplace, doesn't know or care where it came from. It just knows it came in from somewhere, and then sends it off to Scallywag. Scallywag figures out exactly what, Scallywag knows how to handle some predetermined, depending on the implementation of Scallywag, it'll know how to handle certain types of webhooks. If it's a Bitbucket provider, it'll know how to handle a Bitbucket hook. If it's a GitLab, if it supports multiple, it'll be able to, parse multiple payloads, and then it'll send back some sort of generic thing that Hook can then act upon, and then maybe send another API call or whatever it does, or start a
Okay, and so if my organization, or whatever, if I have people who want to use both GitLab and GitHub, is that, are you imagining that I would have a single Prow deployment that would be able to handle both of those, or would I have a GitHub Prow deployment and a GitLab Prow deployment?
Ideally, it would be a single deployment, would be able to handle both. And maybe even a single instance of Scallywag, or possibly multiple instances of Scallywag. Now, if you're talking about like within a, so you're talking about like for different projects, but in the same org, being able to configure things differently.
Like right now, you know, Prow, like sort of all of the various repos that are across different orgs, you know, like there's Kubernetes SIGs as well as Kubernetes and a bunch of different repos, and all of those are handled by prow.k8s.io. And so if there, you know, the question is, if we then wanted to, you know, start supporting the Kubernetes GitLab org or whatever, would we want to, would the idea be that we support that in prow.k8s.io, or would we then create like a prow.gitlab.k8s.io?
Yeah, no, the idea would be that there's just this Scallywag service, which is just another little microservice that's working with your existing Prow, your existing Prow instance. And, so it would, honestly, it would depend on the way I'm kind of thinking about this is that that really what we're doing is defining an interface and then maybe shipping, a couple of implementations with it for the most popular Git providers, let's say, but it's going to depend on the implementation, right? And because it's designed to be generic and because it's designed to make it easy for you to create your own implementation, it'll kind of depend on the implementation you create. But at least in terms of the like default implementation that we ship with Prow, the idea there would be that it would support GitHub and GitLab and whatever. I mean, there can be a conversation about what should be those handful of popular providers that should be supported by default. But yeah, the idea is it doesn't make much sense to me at this point, at least, to have a different Prow instance just to handle a different Git provider. I don't think it's designed to really just ideally the Scallywag that I'm picturing that I would want in my Prow cluster is one that supports GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket, maybe a couple others, and that it would just be able to basically within itself internally figure out exactly how to have different kind of implementations of this interface within one service, and be able to kind of route things to the correct implementation.
How are you expecting to handle like GitHub isms if different providers provide similar things? Like I'm thinking the LGTM plugin, you can configure it so that it behaves in a specific way if you leave like a GitHub approving review. If GitLab has a different verbiage for that same feature, are you expecting people to, like, will the config allow both names to make it more GitLab native, or will people have to learn the GitHub isms to configure things?
That's a good question, and that's something I haven't thought through very thoroughly. So that's something I need to think about more. Yeah, I mean that's kind of I'm not sure the best way to handle that. I mean, I'm just sort of expecting that there's going to be some trade-off where whenever you make a generic interface like this, it's going to kind of, there's going to be some differences that kind of get washed out a little bit, between the different implementations. So I'm not quite sure how to handle that, but think through that and figure that out. I mean, my hope is that the core functionality should all kind of be the same, but who knows? It may come down to something like where we're just like, okay, well, if you use, we just know that if you use GitLab for Scallywag, here's a couple of plugins that aren't going to work the way you're expecting them to, or they might not work at all, or something like that. That may be part of it. Just like, okay, if there's, if a particular provider deviates significantly from the GitHub model, which we're kind of using as the basis for this interface, then it may make it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about that some more because
I think it might be nice, and if we're all implementing the same interface, and maybe just like throwing not yet implemented errors or whatever, at runtime, maybe inside of check config, it would be nice to validate that I've chosen this set of plugins and I've chosen this provider for Scallywag, and that actually will work with my version of Prow.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Before you deploy it and have it fall over.
So that at the very least, you're getting a message that says, "Hey, by the way, this plugin doesn't work with this provider, or
Right.
this particular feature of this plugin doesn't work with this provider," or something of that nature. Yeah.
Yeah. And that sort of informative level of like, hey, what you've configured may technically be possible, but is generally not suggested. That's what check config is currently doing.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That sounds very reasonable.
So, Eric, just for your FYI, we just started talking because there was nobody in the call, and Will's actually the only person on the agenda. We have people here now, but so I guess if anybody has anything to put onto the agenda, go ahead and throw it in there pretty quick. Otherwise, I think we're probably finished. And I mentioned to Will that the doc that he had to send out to the mailing list for review.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm happy ending early if we are done with the agenda.
I might have just one thought on the topic for GitHub Enterprise installations. Maybe consider that as well, or think about it.
Well,
like consider talking about it, or you have something. What do you mean?
No, I think for your Scalvik proposal, it might be interesting for others. Like if you were thinking about GitLab already, it might be interesting to think about things that are special to maybe a GitLab or a GitHub Enterprise that is on-prem somewhere.
Yeah, so I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I mean GitHub Enterprise. I don't know how far back in the version history Prow currently supports GitHub Enterprise, but it does support it, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Big asterisk.
I think the answer is yes, except that I don't know that there's any. We don't certainly, yeah, I don't know that we don't have anyone who we know. I feel like there's been some demand and there have been some attempts, and I think there are maybe some bugs and they may or may not have been resolved. But ideally it would work, and we would certainly want it to work. And I feel like other than, devil being in the details of like this particular weird thing doesn't work right. Like I think Git cloning, there's maybe some fix or something. But for the most part, I think it should work. But
yeah,
I don't know. I would not be at all surprised if it's like, oh, hey, this, I think there are probably things that don't work, and that's obviously not the Kubernetes does not use GitHub Enterprise, so that isn't our core use case, and so we'll need someone else who is a fan of Prow, who has GitHub Enterprise. Like for me, it's not important for Google, and it's not important for Kubernetes, so. I'm not aware of what the needs are, but if there are people who like Prow and like GitHub Enterprise and want to push that forward, that would be super awesome.
And if there
that was just a thought for me because we're at Kima, we're using GitHub.com as well, so it's not a priority for us. I just wanted that to be maybe considered as well.
Yeah, and we've done some. So we on the Jenkins X project, we've definitely done some work on using GitHub Enterprise with Prow, and I think it's been a while since I've looked at it, but last time I checked, it basically did work. Again, it's been a minute now, so I haven't. I can't say that with much more confidence than what other folks have said, but yeah, but GitHub Enterprise is close enough to. There was one snag we had where we were on we had an instance of GitHub Enterprise that was like an older version, and there were some assumptions about the GraphQL API that were only correct if you were on at least a certain version, and it kind of went away when we upgraded. But
if there are like LTE versions of GitHub Enterprise that we want to support, potentially doing that in Scallywag might be a reasonable thing if they're going to deviate from the client that we use for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So potentially maybe two interesting things before we head off is that and if people did not see that and you are interested in building the test info repo using Bazel, you need to use a fairly recent version, 23.0 or later. And we apparently have been having some issues where like the last 3 Prow updates, so I think Fridays, Mondays, and Tuesdays didn't actually run because the image was an old version of Bazel. So we actually think that the head of Bazel head of Prow is good, and that's what we're deployed to, but that's not actually. So I hope to correct that today, and that may actually not work correctly. So look
But
for
the
an
rollout
exciting.
was actually fine. It was just the Bazel job to make the PR that was broken.
No, the opposite. I merged the PR to do the rollout, and then the rollout job, which also uses Bazel, failed.
Oh.
So we think that I thought that we were at whatever. We thought that we were at Tuesday's version, and then I looked at it and it's like, oh, actually we are on Thursday.
Okay, makes sense. Cool. I guess that's all we've got for the week. Thanks everyone for joining in, and hopefully we'll see this on YouTube.
All right, bye.
Thanks, everyone.